Hey friends, so I've got a story to share. Back in 2013, Keith Marshall was halfway through his tour of the United States Flow festivals, and he built up quite a following. His three-poi technique, including the first poi juggling I can recall seeing, won over a lot of admiration. He got a lot of people excited, not just for the possibility of learning new tricks, but also the possibilities of merging together the worlds of poi spinning and juggling. We were at Ignite Festival in Joshua Tree, California, and the heat had been so intense that a small group of us piled into the Flow Toys van and went to a local bar to get lunch and, more importantly, access to an air conditioner. While we were there, I voiced a couple concerns I'd had about the idea of the poi and juggling worlds merging. While the excitement many of the young tech spinners had for the possibility was palpable, there were some aspects of that merger that had me a little worried. I could already see shifts in the culture around poi to help fit it into the juggling box that I found troubling. One of the other people at the table, a juggler, jumped in and claimed that he believed that the etymological root of the word juggle meant that it always was supposed to refer to all forms of object manipulation and spinning. And I'll confess that I was more than a little confused. The question was not over whether indeed merging the poi and juggling worlds was a good idea and what cost that might come at for poi spinners, but that such a question was moot because poi's classification as a type of juggling seemed self-evident to him. After all, what use was there in asking if poi assimilating into the juggling world was a good idea, if indeed you could just say that poi always had been a type of juggling? This was the first time that a juggler and I talked past each other on whether poi was or should be part of the juggling world, but it was far from the last. In the past 10 plus years, I have had this same debate in countless forms with countless people. That debate has been appearing a lot more often lately, and I think it's time to really interrogate both the premises that it's based upon and actually answer the question my friends seem so keen to avoid. Is placing poi in the juggling world actually beneficial to poi spinners? Drex here from Drex Factor Poi, sharing with you the love of poi spinning and flow arts to benefit your brain, and in this video, I am exploring one of the biggest poi questions of our era. But before we dive in, I just want to give a quick shout out to the friends of the channel. Big thanks to Dark Monk, Fire Mecca, Flow Fests, Flow Toys, Juggling Calling, Pyroterra Light Toys, Spin Balls, and Ultra Poi for helping to make the videos on this channel possible. You can learn more about all these awesome companies and the work that they're doing to support flow artists like yourself by checking out the links down in the description of this video. And special thanks to the non-business friend of the channel, Becca Pekkonen. Thank you so very much for supporting my channel, my work, and my mission. Is poi and/or the flow arts a part of juggling? That's a question that's led to more than a few heated debates both in person and online in the past decade. I've had this debate with friends, strangers, and everyone in between, representing positions ranging from of course to maybe, no, and well, maybe they should be. So why is there even a debate, and what are the contentions on each side? That's what I'm going to dive into in this video. I'm going to do my best to present the arguments in an objective fashion, but I'll be real with y'all, I do have my own position on this, and I'm going to outline why that is. One of the more recent examples of this question coming back up was when a meme got posted to Poi Chat insinuating that it wasn't just poi that is, was, and always had been juggling, but a variety of other movement arts, including rope dart, footbag, color guard, pen spinning, and rhythmic gymnastics too. And I will confess that I got a little heated in the ensuing comment thread, and a big part of the reason for it is that it reflects an attitude I've encountered a lot over the years from jugglers like the one mentioned in my opening story, that I think both has negative impacts on us as poi spinners as well as reflecting badly on the juggling world in general. But why do jugglers think this, and why do some poi spinners agree with them? From what I can tell, there are three major lines of argument and/or motivations guiding it. Let's take a look at each of them. Part 1. Can't we all get along? Both the juggler from my story and the person who posted to Poi Chat both employ something I'll refer to as the a priori argument for poi and flow arts being a form of juggling. A priori is a Latin expression meaning from what is earlier, and it's a form of reasoning in which a person employs deductive reasoning based upon principles which they believe are self-evident. I've encountered two variations on this sort of a priori reasoning. The most common version of the first is as follows. The word juggle entered the English language sometime circa the 14th century CE, and it is used to describe entertaining somebody by performing tricks. Thus, rather than being seen to simply describe the act of toss or contact juggling, people employing this argument hold that the term should be understood from its original context to be a universal word that overlaps either completely or nearly completely with the related phrase, object manipulation. The second is that regardless of its etymology, the word juggle in itself should be understood to simply be the word in English that conforms to a more universal Platonic idea of using objects to perform tricks. We have evidence of what we would recognize as toss juggling going back more than 4,000 years, with the concept independently reinvented in countless cultures across the world. So there's an argument to be made that juggling in itself is more or less universal to all human cultures, and that the word juggle is just the framing of this concept in the English language. The thinking goes that juggling, then, is the closest universal concept to what we see expressed with poi, and thus the label that should be applied to it. I will confess that I have some degree of skepticism of both of these lines of reasoning, but I also believe they're both ultimately irrelevant on a practical level. But more on that later. First, let me explain my skepticism for the a priori arguments. I think the biggest thing I'd touch on here is just that I think we should be very careful when we ascribe many concepts as being universal to all human culture and experience, especially because a lot of those conversations wind up getting filtered through a Western European lens, whether intentional or not. We sometimes have a bad habit of taking our particular framing of an otherwise universal concept, applying our own unique cultural baggage to it, and just assuming that our framing of that concept is also universal. One example, poi comes from kapa haka in Māori culture. Is kapa haka juggling then too? Is it dance? Is it performance? Or is it something that's outside of our cultural understanding? That is, something we need to learn more about Māori culture to truly get a grasp on. In trying to frame kapa haka as dance, we are in many ways forcing it into a box that has a really specific context here in the Western world, and that context may not be appropriate for how Maori people see kapa haka. We don't tend to think of dance as being something one does to intimidate one's enemies, or something one does as a mark of respect for a person of high social standing. To those of us born in Western European traditions, dance is seen as something artistic, frequently feminine, and often silly or frivolous. Thus, in framing kapa haka as a form of dance, we may be right that there are characteristics that we associate with dance, that is, moving rhythmically to a beat in an aesthetically pleasing fashion, but we're also applying our specific cultural baggage to the concept. There may be a human universality to moving to music, but that doesn't mean our framing of that concept within our own culture is universal too. Likewise, while I think it's safe to say that juggling is something that either is or is close to broadly universal among human cultures, that doesn't mean that it is the appropriate box to put every movement art that involves performing tricks with an inanimate object into. Because again, there's some really specific cultural baggage that we in the Western European tradition have that may not be appropriate for how performing with inanimate objects is seen in other cultures. And while I'm at it, I also specifically want to address the linguistic argument, because I also think there are elements of it that are ahistorical. One of the biggest things we have to recognize here is that language is a living and evolving thing, and the context we think of for the word juggling in our era is very different from what it would have been for English speakers of the 14th century. For at least the first couple centuries, juggling was understood to apply more specifically to magic tricks and sleight of hand, a connotation that it no longer has. The idea of it applying specifically to what we see as juggling today, and more specifically toss juggling, wasn't even common until the 19th century. And more to the point, I have yet to find a single source within the poi world, whether Maori or Western, that refers to poi as juggling before about the late 2000s or so. Granted, poi in general is so poorly documented, and absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, but I do find the timing of that shift interesting. But I'll get more into that later. Also, if you have access to a source from within the poi world that does identify themselves as a juggler from before that time period, drop me a comment and point me to where. And no, jugglers saying poi is juggling doesn't count. I want to hear it from the people actually doing the thing. There's also a second line of reasoning I frequently see when it comes to placing poi and flow arts under the juggling umbrella, and it takes the form of comparing what's going on in the United States to the scene in Europe. As I understand it, poi has been considered a part of the juggling and circus scene in most of Europe now for many years. Indeed, many of the first generation of tech poi spinners connected to each other through European circus festivals. And I'll be the first to admit that my experience with the poi, circus, and juggling scene in Europe and elsewhere in the world is quite limited, and it could well be that all of these things live in perfect harmony. If so, that's great for the people who engage in the scene there. But I also kind of suspect that things might be more complicated than that for a few reasons. The first is that when told that poi and juggling are frequently framed as separate here in the United States, the reaction I almost always see is that the American approach to things is somehow pathological. There's not a lot of curiosity as to why these identities might be considered separate here. There's a kind of extension of that a priori argument in that, since that's the way it's done in Europe, that's the default state of things and how it should be done everywhere else in the world. And yeah, remember our whole discussion that a European framing of a concept might not be universal to all human culture? And while I'll go more into depth on this point later on, I can't help but notice that there's a paucity of representation for poi on the top 40 jugglers list, as well as in the gala showcases of the European Juggling Convention. Both of these are efforts led by Europeans, and there's not a lot of poi representation there. So I kind of suspect if the integration of poi into the juggling scene in Europe is kind of a given, that its integration there might be superficial at best. But jumping back to the language argument for a moment, I will also admit that there's an additional dimension to that line of reasoning that might indeed circle us back around in a different direction. Language is indeed a living and evolving thing, and what different words mean drifts over time. So, what if that's what's happening right now? The 19th century definition of juggling was certainly quite narrow, and starting in the 1980s with the work of Michael Motion and the growth of Cirque Nouveau, I think it can be argued that artists who practiced juggling were innovating upon many of its tenets to grow the art form in ways that probably would not have been considered juggling by 19th century artists. British juggler Luke Burrage tackled this very question in an exquisitely detailed video essay on the definition of juggling, noting that in some ways, juggling has evolved away from describing a specific activity and has come to mean an activity that someone who considers themselves a juggler performs. I agree with many of his conclusions, and I also can't help but note that he ultimately rules out poi as well as several of the other arts in the poi chat meme laid claim to in the process. So why exactly would that language be evolving beyond simply the new experiments of jugglers and into the realm of trying to reframe other movement arts that haven't historically been considered juggling and reclassify them as juggling? That takes us to what I'd identify as the third and final reasoning for placing poi and flow arts under the umbrella of juggling. This is what I'll refer to as the communal argument. The essence of this line of reasoning is that we can define juggling not purely through etymological or philosophical means, but as a byproduct of the communities that come together around and adjacent to it. No one can argue that the spaces jugglers inhabit haven't also been inhabited by poi spinners, roped artists, and a host of other types of prop manipulation and flow arts. Jugglers have frequently, though not always, been present in spaces I've inhabited as a poi spinner, and many have become friends and/or inspired me. We can't deny that there are major cultural overlaps here. Everything from features at events targeting all these groups to modes of dress, the music they listen to, and a lot of the jargon that they share. I also have to point out that buried within this line of reasoning is something that I think goes a little deeper than simply people inhabiting the same spaces. Given that both poi and juggling tend to appeal to people who move in counterculture circles, there's also a degree to which this reformulation of juggling as a concept appeals to ideals of community, inclusion, and cooperation. There have been many people with whom I've had this debate who ultimately fall back onto a sentiment that is some variation on, "I just think we're a much stronger community when we're working together." Jugglers see this as an invitation to be included in a community. They see it as an act of benevolence. But I don't. Let me tell you why. Part 2. Setting the record straight. So now that I've spent a good amount of time deconstructing all these different arguments, it is actually not a bad idea for me to deal with the question on its own merits. Should poi be considered a form of juggling? My answer to that question would honestly be that it depends upon the style of poi being performed or used, but by and large, still no. Many years ago, I remember having a remarkably candid conversation with a juggler about why he didn't find poi a particularly engaging form of prop manipulation, and I think his answer was actually quite revealing. He centered that answer around one very important concept: risk. A great deal of tossing and balancing found in modern juggling centers around creating moments of risk. That is, moments when the trick could fail and the prop could fall. Those moments of risk guide an audience through an experience that alternates between tension and catharsis. When a juggler goes to perform a trick, they very literally have a bunch of balls in the air. We wait with bated breath to see whether they will drop one or more of their props, but we are always guaranteed a resolution. Either the juggler will drop the prop and we will have a moment of disappointment, or they will land their trick and we will have a moment of euphoria. In both cases, though, we experience catharsis. This cycle of tension and catharsis around performing a trick is broadly true of many other circus arts as well, and I believe this is why juggling has sat comfortably beside acrobatics, trapeze, and a variety of other disciplines in this performance tradition. The only difference is the scale of the risk, ranging from dropping a prop to genuine bodily harm. This risk is at the core of juggling as an art form, and having this relationship of tension and catharsis remains a part of it, whether the performance venue is in a three-ring circus, a street performance, or in a video posted to social media. But, as my juggler friend pointed out all of those years ago, Poi does not have this same relationship with its audience. Arguably, there is an element of risk with Poi overall, given that we have to keep the prop moving in order to avoid having the tether go slack and return our prop to rest. But the consequences of this happening aren't even the prop landing on the ground. They're simply the prop hanging uselessly from the performer's hand. There is no catharsis when a Poi trick goes wrong or when it goes right. Rather than creating a relationship of tension and catharsis with the audience, more often the words that I hear used to describe high-level Poi spinning are things like mesmerizing or captivating. In other words, most classical Poi and tech Poi centers more around creating an experience for the audience that just kind of vibes, giving them a form of constant stimulation that doesn't include the same peaks and valleys of juggling. And this has both positive and negative impacts on the world of Poi. On the one hand, one of those things it's done for us is made our art feel very accessible. Many of us have had the experience of spinning and breaking out some of our hardest tricks and have a passerby stop to ask us if they can try out the prop themselves. To a certain degree, we work within a system where the difference between very hard and very easy Poi tricks isn't super easy for casual viewers to pick out. And though I don't know this for sure, I suspect it's comparatively rare for jugglers doing 5-club patterns to find random passers-by, asking them to borrow their clubs to work through their own favorite cascades and balances. Juggling on its face presents a level of difficulty that makes it feel less immediately accessible than Poi. Frequently in Poi performances, we've used the addition of fire as a catalyst to either add a degree of risk or to create that heightened sense of tension that we see in the juggling world. But yet again, that tension exists in a more or less constant state during the performance rather than building and releasing tension through risk like juggling does. And just to be clear, there are absolutely elements of juggling that just vibe as well. Contact juggling in particular includes several techniques that lack the heightened tension that we associate with toss juggling tricks and fall more into the mesmerizing camp. But these techniques are the exception in the juggling world, rather than the rule. By the same token, one of the chief identifiers of manipulation as a style within the Poi world is a focus on performing juggling techniques with Poi. In these cases, with Poi juggling and contact Poi, the element of risk is added through the inclusion of those juggling techniques. But this is a subset of stylistic techniques within Poi, rather than the core set of techniques taught for the prop. Now that may seem like kind of an arbitrary or even overly semantic way of framing Poi and its relationship to juggling, but I actually think that difference has some huge real-world implications that we should acknowledge in any discussion around Poi and its relationship to the juggling world. Part 3. The Trojan Horse. There is actually a really powerful implication in what I outlined in the last section, and it goes to the heart of a question that most arguments classifying Poi as a type of juggling simply skip over. Namely, is being classified as a type of juggling actually in our best interests as Poi spinners? Something that I find very curious about the a priori arguments for Poi being juggling, whether it be what the original definition of the word juggling was, or whether there is a platonic ideal of juggling that Poi fits into, is that they kind of bypass this question entirely. How can we ask if merging Poi into the juggling world is a good or a bad thing when it's self-evident that Poi is a form of juggling after all? I don't think that this means of framing the conversation to avoid that question is coincidental at all. In fact, I think, whether explicit or not, the very purpose of these a priori arguments is to avoid engaging with that very question, because it's actually a really sticky one. In the last section, as I described my conversation years ago with the juggler about poi lacking the kind of risk that I think is core to juggling as an art and experience, the person who made this formulation was doing so specifically because he wanted to explain why he didn't find poi as interesting and stimulating as juggling. And to be perfectly clear, there's nothing wrong with that. Not everybody has to like the same things. We can share space, ideas, and interact as people, even if we don't share exactly the same common interests. But it does imply a relationship that I find at least a little bit troubling. I think that this juggler was right in that risk is indeed something that jugglers expect to encounter within the realm of prop manipulation. As well they should. It's core to the art they're interested in practicing. But when they don't encounter that, it appears to lead many to dismiss forms of prop manipulation that don't involve that element of risk as being lesser forms of what they're framing as juggling. When we place juggling as the platonic default of this idea that overlaps with object manipulation in several other disciplines, we're also creating a hierarchy in the process. Juggling, and more specifically toss juggling, is the center of this world and the standard by which all other forms of prop manipulation are judged. Because of this, the fewer characteristics a prop's core vocabulary of movement shares with toss juggling, the less skillful, artistic, and disciplined it's seen as. And to be clear, I don't think that any of this is a malicious, conscious, or even deliberate process. I think it inevitably follows from the practice of making one specific kind of prop manipulation the default. And I see many, many real-world consequences of this. For one, poi is deeply unpopular in the juggling world. The Top 40 Jugglers list has been a project maintained now for 21 years by the aforementioned Luke Burridge. In that time, despite a plethora of jugglers online insisting that jugglers have always thought of poi as a type of juggling, only 2 artists who use poi have ever been featured on the list, both of whom won their spots by juggling rather than by spinning their poi. The International Juggling Association, arguably one of the most important international bodies for promoting and educating the general public on the history of juggling, has had only a single article that I can find in the past 5 years specifically on poi spinning, and that article was riddled with misinformation and wild extrapolations from spotty data. They have also included several spotlights for people who juggle their poi, but appear not to have featured anyone who embraces any other technique for poi. How is it that in a community that professes to have always thought of poi as a type of juggling, that artists like Nick Woolsey, Ronan McLaughlin, or Yuta Imamura, poi spinners that by any objective measure are some of the greatest artists to practice the art form, have never been featured on either the Top 40 Jugglers list or on the IJA's website? And this attitude doesn't end there. The few poi spinners and other flow artists I've seen go to attend circus school have all had one thing in common. They come out of it abandoning their original prop. They're pushed into toss juggling and acrobatics, and I think the reason is pretty simple. The circus world has had formal curricula in place for disciplines it recognizes artistically. Rather than expand to create curricula for other disciplines, however, it's simply easier to squeeze artists from those other disciplines into the boxes that they already recognize. The implication has been clear to both me and other poi spinners now for more than a decade. You are neither seen nor respected in the juggling community unless you place yourself in proximity closer to toss juggling. That attitude isn't just implicit either. It's been made explicit countless times, both in personal conversations as well as in public discourse. Time.
Then you have these poi, but even then you can say, well, yeah, the poi is a cross between the ball and the club. I don't really see the
maybe
X factor.
And time.
It's not what I'm doing, basically. It's just I'm doing juggling. It's too small. For me, it's just juggling is bigger.
And time again.
We're club jugglers. Of course it's better than poi.
Poi is the object of ridicule, whether it's jugglers joking,
Did everyone just get tricked into loving poi?
being harassed for expressing an appreciation for poi, or simply being barred from positions of visibility and respect. This sort of intimidation and gatekeeping has been present for years. And honestly, it does make sense in the taxonomy jugglers have created for their art. If I was judging poi by the standards of juggling, I would probably find it lacking too. So when we set the standards by which poi should be judged as being centered in the juggling world, that doesn't create a space that is inclusive to us. It creates a space in which we have to assimilate to receive respect. This is the piece of the puzzle that makes me the most upset, because over time I've gradually seen more and more poi spinners internalize this sense of inferiority. Rather than explore and expand on the art form as we've known it for decades, they're told they're not creating art on a high enough level. They're told that the world they inhabit is too small and that juggling is the real, valid, and more historically established art. The irony being that it's actually the juggling world that is small and narrow, because rather than expanding to include the features of additional disciplines, it instead has to squeeze us into a really specific box to include us at all. And regardless of how you try to define the word juggling, I don't think that attempts to assimilate poi into it have been positive for our community overall. During the heyday of the tech poi boom in the late 2000s and early 2010s, new frameworks and works of scholarship on poi movement dropped with dependable regularity. Since manipulation has risen to become the dominant style, however, this focus has switched instead to adapting tricks already pioneered in the juggling world to poi. That may mean that people are the first to perform a given trick, but it doesn't mean that the trick is an original work. I think we've seen a decline in originality and creativity in the poi world as a result of assimilation into juggling. And I think we've seen an alarming number of both new and old artists internalize their position of prop manipulation hierarchy as being beneath that of jugglers and either switch props to climb to a higher rank of the hierarchy, or simply accept the microaggressions that come along with being near the bottom. And yes, doubtlessly, if you're watching this video and you're a levy wand spinner, fiber whip artist, glover, glow stringer, or any of the countless other prop disciplines that poi spinners have historically looked down upon and said,
First time.
you know what? Good point. We absolutely do this stuff too. It's not right when jugglers do it to us, and it's not right when poi spinners do it to you either. I would also be remiss if I didn't point out that this meme of prop manipulation hierarchy was also something that was already present in the poi community even before manipulation took off as a style. The whole tech versus flow debate has its roots in the ways that tech poi spinners have acted as gatekeepers towards people who focused more on movement than on building out their trick skill trees. We already were not great at this, and assimilation has dialed this problem up to 11. So if indeed the merit of assimilating into the juggling world is dubious for poi spinners, it does bear asking, why do so many jugglers and even some poi spinners want to do it anyway? What do they get out of this arrangement, and what's wrong with poi spinners viewing ourselves as an independent art form? The answer, I think in all honesty, is that they kinda need us. And I think that's a fact the juggling world is having a really, really difficult time processing. Part 4. Who's Wagon? So I want to jump back real quickly to the story that I opened this whole treatise on. While I'm sure that the argument my juggler friend advanced was one that existed before that discussion, I had never encountered it in my travels or interactions with jugglers before that. And it stuck out to me not just because it seemed to sideline my original question, but also because it felt strangely like somebody trying to proselytize to me. And I don't think that the timing of it was a coincidence. 2013 was a very, very important year in the flow arts. That was the year that the number of flow festivals peaked out at 50. We had an average of 1 per week that year, and most weeks you'd actually have a choice between multiple festivals being run in different parts of the country. And it was also right after I'd posted the first ever top 10 poi spinners list to my YouTube channel, which, though controversial, was enormously popular. I'll be the first to admit that I copied the vast majority of the format from Luke Burridge's top 40 jugglers list, and in hindsight, it might have been a good idea for me to hit him up and ask him before I copied his process and format. But there was also something that really stuck out to me, and I'm willing to bet stuck out to other people about our 2 lists that year. Luke published his results as multiple videos rather than a single video compilation that year, so it's hard to run a direct comparison. But of those videos, the one with the most views is just below 5,000. The top 10 poi spinners list from the same year, though, It currently sits at more than 200,000. In other words, in 2013, Poi Spinning and Flow Arts were wildly popular, both in person and online. But things were perhaps not as rosy in the circus world. By the end of the decade, Ringling Brothers, Big Apple Circus, and Cirque du Soleil, three of the biggest circus companies in the world, had all declared bankruptcy. Granted, they've all reemerged since, but in each case, it's only the result of being heavily subsidized by philanthropic interests. Attendance has not recovered in the intervening years. What's more, by 2013, a decline in attendance to the EJC from its peak in 2011 had already begun. By the close of the decade, that attendance had dropped more than 9% from the decade previous. And granted, this next point is more anecdotal rather than data-driven, but I can remember around 2013 having conversations with friends who were not in either the flow or juggling world about this debate, and I was kind of surprised to find that juggling and circus had kind of a brand problem. The people I talked to thought of circus and juggling as being more oriented for children's entertainment, and though few knew exactly what flow arts actually meant, the inclusion of the word arts in the title suggested something that rang intriguingly highbrow. So at this point, you can probably see where this is leading. Poi and Flow Arts were on a boom of creative output and cultural relevance, while the momentum for circus was headed a little bit in the opposite direction. Side note, I know I'm using circus and juggling more or less interchangeably in this section, and that has more to do with it being difficult to find solid metrics for the popularity of juggling at the time, but it also does have to be said that they were frequently positioned synonymously to me in discussions with jugglers at the time. If you want to take that as a gap in my reasoning, I certainly don't blame you, but show me the data that disproves my case. So, what do you do when you're facing existential threats and you see another art that's arguably pretty similar on the rise? Seems like a great time to hitch a ride on that wagon. Or perhaps convince them to hitch a ride on your wagon. Because after all, the props that sit at the bottom of the hierarchy aren't going to be the ones that drive the ship now, are they? Poi spinners and flow artists looked at the degree of respect conferred to jugglers and circus performers in many parts of the world and sought to place themselves within an already established and respected art form. And, more specifically, tech poi spinners looked to numbers juggling as a subculture and saw a lot of similarities in terms of skill trees, an emphasis on virtuosity at the expense of presentation, and friendly competition. So what if the price was taking a lower spot on the social ladder? That just meant you had to pick up a whole bunch of challenging new tricks to fit in. For jugglers, folding in poi spinners and flow artists potentially meant a boost in attendance for juggling events and more people buying juggling equipment. It also didn't hurt that it gave them the chance to put those scruffy upstart American flow artists back in their place. The irony being that in the long run, I don't think that this strategy actually worked out for either party. For one thing, we didn't know it at the time, but the boom in flow festivals turned out to be a bubble that collapsed within a couple years. Event attendance dropped, and there was a huge amount of generational turnover, with many of the big stars of the early 2010s leaving the scene by the middle of the decade. And while promoting the idea of poi being a part of juggling seemed and continues to seem very inclusive to many jugglers, the reality is that we just haven't shown up to boost the attendance to a lot of circus events. Personally, I think it's because there was always a cultural gap between jugglers and poi spinners, and because juggling meetups center toss juggling so completely, they only managed to capture a limited percentage of poi spinners, while many others simply returned to their flow events in the woods or fell out of the scene entirely. There's this old joke in the business world that when you merge together two failing companies, you rarely get a successful company out of the deal. You wind up with a much bigger failing company that's now also much harder to run. Over the summer of 2023, there was a post in a Facebook group called Circademics by a young woman looking for input on a project she was working on regarding the taxonomy of juggling. In her first draft, it was pretty clear that she knew nearly nothing about flow arts. For example, she placed rope dart as a subset of poi. Though I didn't and still don't believe that poi spinning is a part of juggling, I at least felt an imperative to help her understand the flow arts world a little better and threw out several suggestions on how she could update this part of her organizational chart. She took a lot of that feedback and integrated it into future revisions, and though I could still see some inaccuracies, it was at least a huge improvement. So imagine my surprise when a couple months later, she releases copies of the chart as a paid product. Bear in mind, she at no point in her posts on this project said that she was creating something that she was going to sell. And nowhere on her poster does it credit myself or any of the other people who gave her feedback and corrected her mistakes. Our work was simply used to give the veneer of a more refined and more inclusive product. If there is a better metaphor for the relationship between the juggling and poi world currently, I'm not sure what it is. Part 5. The Māori of it all. So there is one other aspect of this that I haven't talked about yet, and lacking another spot to place it, I'm just going to stick it awkwardly close to the end. And that's in our discussion around the relationship between poi and juggling. We haven't mentioned the true roots of poi at all. Namely, do Māori people think that poi is a form of juggling? Do they think that their art fits under this umbrella? I'll be candid that I think the topic probably deserves an entire video unto itself, and that it's a difficult question to answer because sources are more than a little spotty. But I have found one that I think provides at least some answers that I think are relevant. In her incredibly detailed 2004 paper on the history of poi, Karen Parengatai identifies several games played in different Polynesian traditions that almost certainly represent ancestral practices from which poi evolved, and all of them fit clearly into a framework that she herself identifies as being a Polynesian form of juggling. Examples include hiko, hapo, fuega, te agua, and the antecedent to poi known as pe or pe'i. Crucially, however, Parengatai identifies a point in which there is a split from this juggling tradition toward placing poi more firmly in the dance or kapahaka camp. Again, this is a question that I think should probably be explored more deeply in another video, but I do just want to stick a pin in it because one point I've seen made about poi with regards to how it relates to juggling is a lack of respect shown to our lineage. And you know what? There's absolutely a valid point there. But I think that lineage passes through Māori hands rather than those of Western jugglers, and yes, we absolutely should respect and explore it more. Is there potentially a tension in arguing about being assimilated into the juggling world in an art form that arguably has been appropriated in many ways from an entirely different tradition? Yeah, there almost certainly is. Okay, so at this point, we've haggled over semantics, we've talked about why putting poi into the juggling world in itself creates a hierarchy, we've also talked about part of what I think is motivating the attempts to merge the two worlds and how the direct antecedent to poi fits into all of this. So how about we talk about what we do with this information? Is there a way to resolve these differences? Part 6. A little respect. Hard as it may be to believe, my agenda here is not to sow discord. I honestly think that that already exists, and I'm simply outlining why. But it does beg an obvious question. Is there a way forward in which both jugglers and poi spinners can coexist? And honestly, I think the answer is yes, but it's going to take some work. One of the biggest pieces of pushback I'm anticipating from this video is going to be people accusing me of creating division, and I think it's important to note that I don't think that acknowledging differences inherently leads to conflict. We can see, respect, and celebrate differences without those differences becoming a source of conflict, unless we choose to make them a source of conflict. The flip side of this, of course, is that if a person sees acknowledging differences as inherently leading to division or conflict, that it seems to also kind of imply that they don't see a way to peacefully coexist without those differences being removed or hidden. In other words, that others become more like them. And for the record, I've had plenty of great interactions with jugglers over the years and shared space with many of them, and plan to continue doing so in the future. My problem is not with individual jugglers, but with the culture around it that many participate in, whether they know it or not. And because of that, I don't think that me or even the majority of poi spinners are going to truly feel comfortable or even welcome in spaces that jugglers have created given the status quo. One of the biggest and most important things that needs to be resolved is that we need to acknowledge that trying to assimilate poi spinners by reframing juggling as being a more universal concept is not in itself an inclusive act. Jugglers need to acknowledge that the way that they have framed the concept of juggling has centered themselves, and in doing so created a hierarchy that places other props in a place of inferiority. The message is both implicit and explicit within juggling spaces. Even many of my well-intentioned juggler friends frequently just refuse to acknowledge that poi spinners receive microaggressions and abuse from jugglers. And I get why. They benefit from being part of the system as it is. When you're part of an art form that centers you in it, it's easy to miss that fact because you're not the one who's on the receiving end of the jokes or harassment. But whether you want to believe it or not, it is there, and it's very real. So let me be clear. Neither I nor anyone else has to learn to juggle to become a real artist. The second thing I really think is necessary is genuine curiosity. Ask poi spinners about what they do, about what they want to see in an event. A poi spinner isn't simply a juggler waiting to happen. They're unique and valid artists already. Don't understand how that art works? That totally makes sense. Ask us what we love about poi and hear the answers, even if they feel unfamiliar. And honestly, this next note is more of a general one, but all of us in the flow and circus worlds really have to dismantle our egos. Someone having fun with the only 3 tricks they know does not make us ourselves less of an artist or the art we practice any less valid. The shadow work here is that I think many of us are afraid that we won't be taken seriously if there are people out there that do just engage in this stuff casually or just for fun. The art can be fun and also the work you do with it worthy of being taken seriously. Both can be true at the same time. Let me also be clear, if you spin poi and you consider yourself a juggler, that's great. If that's where you find your inspiration and a sense of belonging, then I'm glad to hear it. I do not think any less of you for labeling yourself in a way that makes you feel seen. But I am not, nor have I ever been a juggler. So when jugglers roll up on me and tell me I don't understand the historical context of the term, or that juggling is really the platonic concept for all object manipulation, they don't sound to me like they're trying to be inclusive. They sound paternalistic. That doesn't come from a place of welcoming. It asserts ownership without having to understand the art on its own terms. You want to show poi spinners and other flow artists that we are actually respected in the juggling community? Prove it. Vote us onto the top 40 jugglers list. Write articles about us on the IJA website. Make sure poi spinners, not just poi jugglers, but poi spinners, appear in the galas of juggling festivals and not just open stage. Invite us there. Do the work to make us feel welcome. Make sure that we appear in places of honor and respect. And if that sounds like an impossible or impertinent demand, well, it kind of seems like you agree with me that jugglers showing poi spinners respect is too big a flex. What was that about inclusivity again? Also, just because social media is what it is, I just have to make it clear that this is not an open invitation to harass any of the jugglers that I've mentioned here, nor any jugglers in general. Justice here isn't going out to harass jugglers the way many of them have harassed poi spinners over the years. Justice is that harassment ending entirely. We don't need an eye for an eye here. It's enough that we create spaces for ourselves where we can celebrate our art on our own terms. And finally, here's my message to other poi spinners. Our art is awesome. If others can't recognize what makes us unique in the prop manipulation world, then that's their loss. But it also does come with some responsibility. We shouldn't be trying to beg for a ticket to someone else's party just so we can feel like we're actually real artists. We should strive to create real art on our own terms. That's hard, and it takes a really long time. It requires us to go through the process of selecting what we like and what we don't. It requires us to develop our own theories of performance, aesthetics, and expression for our art. It requires us to find our own forms of discipline and share them with the rest of the world. It's really, really hard work, but I think that it's worth it in the end to create things that stand the test of time. And with that, I think I'm finally done. Have fun with your friends, there's no reason not to. But also, don't put up with people that make you feel small. You do not have to be this tall to get on this ride. What are your thoughts on all this? How do you identify? Is there a way of framing this that I haven't thought of that's really important? Leave me a comment and let me know. Oh my goodness, that was a lot. All told, I think this video took somewhere around 6 months to write and produce, and went through so many drafts. Doing all that work would never have been possible without the backing of my supporters on Patreon. In particular, I want to give a shout out to my Flow patrons who are listed on screen right now. Writing out massive video essays like this would be absolutely impossible without those Patreon supporters. So, if you'd like to see more of them, please sign up to support my work over at patreon.com/DrexFactorPoi. Please and thank you in advance. And hey, if you like this video, you might like the video essay I did on why the flow arts never went mainstream. I'll go ahead and leave a link on screen to that as well as down in the description. Thank you so much for watching. Get out to flow today, and I'll see you with a new video real soon. Take care now. Peace.